So I listened to a debate that Bart Ehrman did with Richard Bauckham about 8 years ago on Jesus and the eyewitnesses, the Gospels as eyewitness testimony. And I wanted to do a critique on Bart Ehrman's argument because I noticed some things that I think a lot of people miss. Let's take a listen.
But even supposing it's not Mark of Jerusalem, whoever it was who could write such a gospel, there's no implausibility whatever in him having got his traditions straight from Peter, who was alive until the year 65.
Yeah, so I disagree with that. One thing that we need to take into account, two things we need to take into account. One is that we have no reliable information about who John Mark may have been. He shows up in the book of Acts, and he does live in Jerusalem, but we don't have any independent verification of any information about this person. But let's suppose he is a Jerusalem-dwelling Jew in the first century. So one question to ask is, how many people in the first century in Palestine could speak Greek, and how many of them could write Greek in any way? So there have been studies of literacy in Palestine in the first century. Richard knows these studies as well as I do. The best study is by Catherine Hetzer, who shows that probably around 3% of the population of Palestine could read and write. So maybe 3% of the population was literate. But most of those people who can read and write can't read and write in Greek. One should ask, how many authors from Palestine do we know of from the first century who could write in Greek? Well, there's two from the entire first century, and they are these are very upper class Jewish aristocrats. And so was Mark one of those? Probably not. I mean, we don't know, but we don't know anything about him. And so in order to assume that Mark could write a gospel like this, you'd have to presuppose that he was one of the very upper crust aristocrats in Palestine, and we simply have no evidence that was the case.
I mean, we'll let Richard respond to that. What about the other contention of Richard, though, is that whoever wrote it, it's perfectly within the timeline for it to have been passed directly, to be from the accounts of Peter, essentially. It's his eyewitness testimony recorded by someone.
Yeah, no, it could have been an account given to him by Judas Iscariot, or an account given to him by John, or account given by Barnabas, or account given by any of the thousands of people who lived in Palestine, but he wasn't in Palestine. He's living outside of Palestine, and so where did he hear his stories? He almost certainly didn't make a trip to Palestine in order to interview an eyewitness. If he did do that, it's surprising that he didn't say that he did that, because that would have helped verify his account if he had said that I've actually gotten this from an eyewitness, but he says nothing of the sort.
Well, a couple of things to respond there. Firstly, the identity of this writer, but also why you think it is plausible, Richard, that these are actually the recorded testimony of Peter.
Can we just go back? I mean, I don't want to get into a long discussion of literacy in Palestine. I think Catherine Hetzer's estimate is probably too low, and there's a good deal of discussion about this. But if we're talking about Jerusalem, we must remember that a large number of Jews living in Jerusalem came from the diaspora. And according to the New Testament, if we take this to be the John Mark of the New Testament, Mark was related to Barnabas, who had estates in Cyprus that he sold. He came from Cyprus. So the Jerusalem community would include a considerable number of people for whom Greek was actually their native language, because they came from Greek-speaking areas of the diaspora. And as you say, elite Jewish citizens, and again, the Book of Acts portrays Mark's mother as having a big house in Jerusalem. They were a wealthy family. He would have had a good Greek education, as, for example, Josephus did.
Can I just ask you a question about that, Richard?
Yeah.
Between the year 1 and the year 65, how many Greek-speaking authors do we know of from Jerusalem?
How many authors from Jerusalem do we know of at all?
Exactly. And how many wrote in Greek?
Well, I'm saying we have very few Jewish authors from that period.
We don't have it, right. And we
from
don't have
Palestine.
any that wrote in Greek.
We don't have any who wrote in Hebrew either.
That's why I don't think that they wrote. I mean, these were not people who were writing. These were people who were illiterate.
Here, he is making an argument from silence. He is essentially going off of what's not there and basing his arguments and conclusions on what's not there rather than what is there. And I think it's helpful to look at what's not there, but we should not put our weight on what is absent. Rather, we should put our weight on what is present and consider what is absent versus the other way around, which I think that's what Ehrman is doing here. He's putting most of his weight on what is not there. For example, he does cite the 3% literacy rate, but he also says that there's no writers between the year of 1 to 65 AD. We don't have any writings from this period. Therefore, the Gospels couldn't have been written by the proposed authors because these people weren't writing. And I think that is an overgeneralization. I think that is an exaggeration. And it shows that his weight is on what is not there rather than what is there. Now, Bauckham, he realizes the 3%, but he also includes, there's a large number of Jews from the diaspora, Greek-speaking areas, whose Greek was their native language. And then Bauckham proceeds to give information that we do have about John Mark, how his mother owned a good-sized house and she even had a servant. His cousin is from Cyprus and even sold property on land in Cyprus. So that gives us some clues that John Mark might not have been in the social class that Ehrman is assuming that he was from. He might have been well in the means to be educated enough and literate enough to write such a gospel. And for Ehrman to say that there's no analogy of Jews writing from this time period is not only an argument from silence, but it's also not entirely true. There are several writings from this time period, from the 1st century and even before, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which they were written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. We have several pseudepigraphal and apocryphal texts written in Greek, and as well as Josephus, how they discussed in the debate. So to say there's nothing from this time period is not only an argument from silence, but it's not entirely true.
Kind of thing.
I think the issue of the titles of the Gospels, I think, is a very interesting one, and I don't pretend to have a fully conclusive reasoning on it, because I think there are some very tricky issues involved. It's very often said that the Gospels are anonymous, and of course, in the sense that the authors are not named within the text of the Gospels, that's perfectly true. They are anonymous. We only have the titles to tell us purported names of the authors. But actually a great deal of ancient literature, Greek and Roman literature, is anonymous in just the same sense. In other words, the authors are not named within the text of the works. We only know who the author is from the titles that have come down to us, but they're titles that were given by scribes or librarians or whatever. So in a sense it's true that the Gospels are anonymous, but it doesn't mean that they were intended to circulate without names. Now, I think the case of Luke's Gospel is particularly interesting here, because Luke, of course, has a preface in which he dedicates his work to a named patron, Theophilus. I think it's inconceivable that a work dedicated to a named patron would have been anonymous, in the sense that nobody knew who wrote it. Theophilus would have known who wrote it, and the earliest circles of people who read it would have known who wrote it. Now, I think Bart agrees that the first people who read the Gospels knew who wrote them, but I think he thinks that this easily got forgotten as the Gospels circulated. One key issue there that I think Martin Hengel highlighted very well is, let's take the case of Luke's Gospel. Suppose everyone knew who Luke was in the original circle where he wrote it. It passes down to other churches, people make copies, take it around. Most of those churches to which Luke circulates already have Mark's gospel. They have to have a way of distinguishing one gospel from the other. And nobody seems to me to have thought of a way in which they could have distinguished them other than calling them the Gospel according to Mark and the Gospel according to Luke. I mean, I'm just trying to establish that the traditional names attached to the Gospels, that there's a good case for saying that those names were always attached to the Gospels from the beginning. Now, who they were, whether Mark was John Mark, and so forth, that's another issue. But
essentially, it goes against Bart's thesis that these were anonymous in that sense. They never had really a person attached to them. They never had, in that sense, a direct connection to eyewitness testimony as well, I guess.
So Bart, I think, thinks that these traditional names were simply given to the Gospels in the late 2nd century. Am I right?
Is that right, Bart?
That's absolutely right. That is what I think. It's important to point out that that when you have the early quotations of these Gospels, nobody identifies them as connected with anybody. And so, for example, you start getting quotations. They appear to be from the Gospels in the early 2nd century, with authors such as, at the end of the 1st century, First Clement quotes Gospels, Ignatius quotes Gospels, Polycarp quotes Gospels, Justin quotes Gospels. None of these they'll quote sayings, but they'll never say this. This is from the Gospel of Mark or this is the Gospel of Matthew. They never do that, and Papias doesn't do that either. And so it's very strange when you get down to Justin Martyr around the year 150 or so. Justin will refer to what appear to be our Gospels, but he doesn't call them by our Gospels. He calls them the memoirs. And in fact, the only memoir that he names is the memoir of Peter. He's talking about the Gospel of Peter. It's not until you get to Irenaeus in the year 180 or 185 that you have any author saying that the Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is the first time that we know that our Gospels go by this name. And so that's why a lot of scholars just don't think that these Gospels were given names. And I agree with Richard that the reason to give these names was to differentiate among them. It's only when you have multiple Gospels in a community that you need to differentiate which one is which. I don't think that it's necessarily the case that the author, that the community that was reading Luke also had Mark in front of it. It might have been the case. It might not have been the case. We have no way of knowing one way or the other. But to say that this gospel was called the Gospel according to Luke in, say, the year 90, I don't think that there's any evidence for that.
Okay, so this is pretty interesting. Someone else actually caught this rather unusual thing that Bart Ehrman is implying here for this section of the debate. Ehrman says that Justin Martyr is referring to the illegitimate, unreliable source, the Gospel of Peter, which is an untrustworthy source. But Justin Martyr is not actually doing that. And it can clearly be demonstrated that he's not doing that. Justin Martyr, writing around 150 AD, he's referring to the memoirs of the apostles. And he goes on to quote from the memoirs of the apostles, and it turns out to be an account that's only found in the Gospel of Mark, or what we call the Gospel of Mark, in which he calls the memoirs of the apostles. And it's not even in the synoptics, and it's especially not in the unreliable Gospel of Peter. So Justin Martyr, writing around 150 AD, says, "And when living with them, sang praises to God, as is made evident in the memoirs of the apostles. The words are the following: I will declare thy name to my brethren. In the midst of the church will I praise thee. Yea, ye that fear the Lord, praise him. All ye the seed of Jacob, glorify him. Let all the seed of Israel fear him." And when it is said that he changed the name of one of the apostles to Peter, and when it is written in the memoirs of him that this so happened, as well as that he changed the names of other two brothers, the sons of Zebedee, to Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Now listen to Mark 3:16 through 17. It says, "These are the 12 he appointed, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James son of Zebedee, and his brother John. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder." So the sons of Zebedee being called the sons of thunder, it's not in the unreliable Gospel of Peter. It's in what we call the Gospel of Mark, and what Justin Martyr was calling the memoirs of the apostles. And he even also says that the memoirs of the apostles were drawn up by the apostles and their followers. He's clearly not talking about the unreliable Gospel of Peter.
Judas, Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter. And Christians in the proto-Orthodox churches, the churches that are supporting the views that later became the dominant views within Christianity, are using a range of Gospels themselves, but they're anonymous. And so by the time of Irenaeus, he's a heresy hunter. He's trying to weed out the false Gospels. And his Gospels are these Gospels that are being widely used, but they don't have names to them. And so they've got to associate them with names of apostles. And so they picked two people, Matthew and John, as two of the apostles, and then they want Gospels representing the two chief apostles of Rome, Peter and Paul. But everybody knows that Peter and Paul didn't write Gospels, and so they associate Peter with, they say Peter's version was written by Mark, his companion. Paul's version was written by Luke, Paul's companion. And so what they're doing is they're naming these Gospels in order to provide them with apostolic credentials. This doesn't happen until all these other Gospels are floating around, and the early Christians have to say, look, these Gospels we're using are apostolic, and the Gospels you're using are forgeries.
So it was all about claiming a certain level of authority for these particular Gospels. It was a helpful device in that sense, Richard.
Yeah, that's why it's not an accident that it's Irenaeus who's the first one to say this, because Irenaeus is our first major heresy hunter. He's the one who's concerned to make sure that his traditions have apostolic roots.
Okay, so for this one, Ehrman gives a pretty interesting scenario for how he thinks the titles got attached to the Gospels that we know today. But before we get into that, I actually think it is quite legitimate for the Gospels to have apostolic authority, but not for a deceitful reason or something scandalous, how Ehrman is implying. If the Gospels don't have apostolic authority, then how could we trust them? How can we be sure that we are actually reading the words of Jesus? It's quite good to have apostolic authority for what we're reading about Jesus. Now, the major issue that I think people miss about this scenario is that it's actually self-defeating. So let's take Mark, for example. If Mark was written in 70 AD and then not applied a name or apostolic authority until 180 AD, when Irenaeus mentions it, then the Gospel of Mark has no apostolic authority at all for over a century. There's a century gap of apostolic authority, so it doesn't work. But then if you backtrack and say, okay, these Christian communities did name Mark at the beginning, well, that does not give it apostolic authority either. And then you attach Peter's name to the Gospel of Mark to give it apostolic authority. Well, now we're back to the exact same traditional view, but now it's in the correct time period, which makes it way more plausible than the scenario that Ehrman is implying. The anonymous Christian community argument fails when it's weighed against the evidence of what we do have. Around 200 AD, the titles start to appear in the manuscript evidence across different countries, even across continents. They start to appear around the same time, late 2nd to the early 3rd century. They start to appear in Egypt, Italy, Greece, Asia Minor, in Africa beyond Egypt, and Europe beyond Italy. And throughout history, there has never been a mix-up, a confusion, or a contradiction with the titles of the Gospels associated with each account. Therefore, one Christian community will have to travel to all of these places, even across continents, to assign the names, or the different communities in these different places had to assign the names, and they all just so happen to match each other. So these scenarios are just highly implausible, and there's a lot of issues with it. For one, we don't see this happening anywhere else in history. And also, why would the Christian communities wait over a century to start assigning the names? And also, wouldn't the Christian community authors, they would not be alive even after a century? So there's just a lot of problems with these scenarios. But what does support the evidence that what we do have, that these titles appear in different places around the same time with never a mix-up, a confusion, or a contradiction in history, is that the authors, the titles, were known from the beginning. So I think it's really important for both sides not to overstate their case. And I know that in a debate setting, there's pressure to respond, or there's you might say things just off the top of your head and you're not quite sure. So that I do understand, but we also need to make sure that we are being reasonable with our arguments, because there's a line to where we can be unreasonable and cross over into an unhealthy skepticism, to where you are skeptical for the sake of being skeptical instead of being reasonably skeptical for the sake of asking questions to get to the truth and to get to a conclusion that is logical, rather than basing conclusions off of fallacies like arguments from silence, because arguments from silence is not evidence of anything. So we really need to be careful not to give false information. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, this critique of the debate that Bart Ehrman did with Richard Bauckham. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.